Hi, I am here today with Josh Slocum, who is the former executive director for the Funeral Consumers Alliance. And Josh is so gracious to spend a little time with me today so I can share this recording with you. And he's going to share his experience of being a part of the Funeral Consumers Alliance and why he is no longer the executive director. So I am excited and prayerful that this conversation will impact us as Christians who are training to be in the end of life doula movement. So, Josh, thank you again for being here. And I may stop you and ask questions if something comes up, but to start, I'm
Sure.
just going to let you introduce yourself and share, just begin to share about your experience and what you're doing now and why and all of those things.
Well, thank you, Laurel. The my experience. So I got interested in funerals as a topic when I was a newspaper reporter in the late '90s and around the turn of the century. Um, and I discovered that there were large corporations, Wall Street traded corporations, that had bought up hundreds, thousands of funeral homes and cemeteries around the country, and that they'd raised their prices to really astronomical levels. And that most people didn't know that this was the case. They didn't know that McGillicuddy Funeral Home was no longer owned by the McGillicuddy family. So I tried to put together an investigative consumer story for the paper that I was working on that would look at what had happened to the prices and sales practices at these formerly family owned funeral homes. Long story short, I discovered a great deal of collusion
Mm.
between the Virginia State Board of Embalmers and Funeral Directors. I was living and working in Virginia, and the industry itself. So what ended up happening is that they denied me, the state regulatory board denied me documents that were releasable under freedom of information law. I was unable to fight that successfully, and I was unable to write that story. So I quickly got a taste of how the industry and the government could collude together against the interests of consumers, and that just sparked my interest more. And I ended up the former executive director of Funeral Consumers Alliance, my friend and mentor, the late Lisa Carlson, hired me. And that became 20 years of working with the organization and the volunteers on everything from protecting the right of families to have home funerals, family directed funerals, educating them about it. But and that was one of the hardest parts of the job and one of the most satisfying parts of the job. It really energized me because I'm very I find it philosophically offensive for the state to tell individuals what they may and may not do unless we're talking about circumstances of imminent danger, right? So it upsets me to see the state trying to interfere in the private actions of families and try to force them to do business with an industry that they don't wish to do business with. But the majority of time at Funeral Consumers Alliance was talking to people and consumer lobbying at the state and federal level for the great majority of the public who was going to use a commercial funeral home. They were not going to do a home funeral, but they didn't want to get ripped off doing it.
Hmm.
So that was the mainstay there.
Yeah. Oh, no, I'm just going to interject. A personal experience is yes, watching family members fork out $10,000, $20,000 for a funeral can majorly increase the grief and the um, say,
Yeah.
lack for a better word, buyer's remorse, right? It
Yeah.
all seems right in the moment. We want to give this, family member, the one that we loved, this wonderful send off, burial, all of those things. You go to the funeral agency and ching ching ching, it's just adding
Mm-hmm.
up, and then you see a price tag of tens of thousands of dollars, and big gulp. I don't know how we're going
Yep.
to do this. And then as the days go by and that person's gone, that I think I've just watched particularly with my mother. The loss of her mother was, do you think she would have even liked that funeral? And here I am out, all these thousands of dollars. It can be very confusing.
Oh yeah, yeah, and most people, and you know this very well, working in the field. Um, what most people think they know about funerals is wrong. Most of what we think we know is information that comes from funeral homes. So we don't
Mhm.
usually get an outside look. What does the law actually require? What does it
Mhm.
not require? What's a reasonable price for this casket or this cremation? Most people don't, because the death transaction, it's not only often unexpected, we don't know exactly when it's going to happen, but it's also something we're not looking forward to. I know it's very, very cliche, but it is still true that in a lot of ways we're a death denying culture. So we put off having to plan for the inevitable, and then we find ourselves having to make confusing and often expensive decisions when we're in the worst frame of mind that we could be in. You know,
Mhm.
going into planning a funeral in the middle of grief is quite literally as debilitating as doing it if you were drunk. You're
Mm.
drunk on
Mhm.
emotion, right?
And
So,
yeah, I want to say one thing. I'm calling a woman whose brother committed suicide in a
mhm,
church where I worked, and this was in New York, and she wanted him to be buried with the family in Half Moon Bay near San Francisco, which is
mhm,
a really cool idea. But the amount of things that had to happen for her to get it the way that she wanted, it was a lot and it was very expensive. But the funeral director, did make a way forward for her.
mhm.
So I just share this little bit to say I wonder, even in this death denying culture where we struggle with our grief, that we even actually are willing to go this far with burial arrangements as part of that denial. Is that, well, if I can just do it right, then things will be okay. Where the industry knows that. The industry knows that they're going to pull at our heartstrings through and help us maybe avoid grief through doing it just right, or as one of my doulas have said, promise you that this casket is airtight, right?
Yeah,
Or whatever these things are, that it's not, it is actually getting in the way of of grief, and that we are delaying facing the fact that our person has died.
I think that's right. And I don't think the majority of funeral directors are not bad people. That's not the message that Funeral Consumers Alliance tried to get across. It's not the message that I want to get across. There are, of course, as in every industry, rapacious people who are there only for the money and will do anything they can to increase their sale, even at, you know, well, obviously at the expense of the family.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not the majority of what goes wrong in funerals. I think the majority of what goes wrong is really what we've normalized. And we've normalized outsourcing what used to be a family centered activity to a commercial sector. And
Mm-hmm.
what you're talking about in terms of people wanting to we often want to make up for what we believe that we didn't do for the deceased during life by giving them a very, to us, memorable funeral.
Mm-hmm.
Um, uh, and and some of these, death is always going to bring up regrets and sadness. Um, but I think if we were more involved in the entire process, spending time with and caring for that person while they're with us but declining, and then also carrying that care through, handling the body, putting mom in the dress that she wanted, um, allowing the family, if they wish, to have a private wake at home in a comfortable environment, not a very dressy sort of commercial environment. If we were involved in this process, I believe that would give us a natural and normal outlet for grieving, but also continuing to live. And I think we would be less inclined to try to salve our feelings and regrets through commercial expenditure.
I agree 100%. And what this takes is education, right? To go the other direction is education. And we are coming into an era where people are wanting that education. There's a crowd of doulas wanting to be educators, making elaborate relationships with, others in the industry. So we are seeing a turn in the tide for sure. It's going to take time, I think, but we are seeing this change. So it'll be cool to see what the future holds. But you've been working on this for a very, very long time. Do you want to share with us a little bit about, so I don't know exactly how many years you've not been the executive director at the
Mhm.
Funeral Consumers Alliance, but you were there 20 years,
Mhm.
and you want to share maybe some of the shifts that you've seen, maybe even prior to this end of life doula role emerging?
Um, Things move more slowly in funerals than they do in other industries. Change does not happen quickly.
Hmm.
Um, the most significant change, but this isn't, this has been going on for many decades before I was doing this, is the move toward cremation and away from burial. It was just a couple of years ago that cremation overtook burial as the most common choice in America at death.
Hmm.
And some of that has to do with cost, because generally it's less costly to do a cremation than a funeral that includes. I mean, the cremation can be just as expensive as a funeral. You can do all the things. You can do embalming. You can do a viewing of the body. You can buy an ornate casket. You can do all those things. But
Hmm.
generally speaking, cremation does tend to be less in the end.
Yes.
Um, some of it is cost sensitivity, but I think that more of it is driven by the change in the way we actually live geographically and in terms of how we see our family connections. So we no longer are a society where you grow up, you go to the local high school, you go to the local technical college, you get a job at the local IBM plant, and then you're buried in the town or church cemetery where you grew up. That's not the reality for a lot of people anymore. So we feel less connected to that physical land where our ancestors are buried. By the time mom or dad dies in the family, the children may be living in the four corners of the globe, or at least the four corners of the United States. So, the idea of doing things the way we've always done in the old hometown is neither practical nor to some people as appealing. And so they say, well, I'm just going to go for cremation.
Hmm.
So I think that's probably the larger driver over cost
Interesting.
savings.
Yeah, I work in a church that has a cemetery, and part of my role there is to speak with people who are, either know they have family lots there, or they're anticipating a death and they want to buy them, or I see a lot of people, they have a box of remains that are 10 years old and they just haven't wanted to part with them, and they finally made a place in their heart that they can part with them
Mm-hmm.
and have them buried. So I guess cremation does allow people to hold on to that body a little bit longer too, versus put it in a casket, see it lowered
Interesting.
into the ground. We did
Mm-hmm.
a direct burial. I mean, it was 3 days after the death. I don't know, it's been 2 months probably now. And it's interesting because we remarked on staff at how we were running around like crazy people trying to get prepared for it, because we're actually out of practice from
Ah,
doing a 3 day turnaround. We were very out of practice. They wanted a ceremony in the church, a graveside rites at the
mm-hmm.
for the burial, and then a reception. And it took the entire staff to get that turned around for 3 days. So it may be
Yep.
people just can't handle that when someone's has died. They take their time a lot. I've
Yeah.
seen. Yeah. So very interesting, but that's not a shift that something's better than what it was, or not. It's just that that's what we've become accustomed to.
Yeah. Well, that I think that's the story of the American funeral writ large. It's just what we've become accustomed to.
Hmm.
The you say that education is necessary. You're right about that, but you really have to start at the basics. We're so far removed from what we used to do. The fact that we have something called the funeral industry, the fact that we have businesses that we call funeral homes that are specifically and only dedicated to memorializing and burying our dead, and that we can call somebody at 4 in the morning if we want and have people come and whisk the body out of the
Right.
home is actually an incredible luxury that is very recent. This did not
Mm,
exist before the last part of the 19th century.
that's a great point.
This is not, we've gotten very used to this, but in historical terms, this is 1 second on the clock of recent history. It's not years and
Right,
years and years.
right. That's fascinating. Well, and I'm tongue-tied here for a minute, but yes, I often think about, going into a public restroom, you don't have to touch anything. But
Yeah.
they've realized that actually being germ-free on everything really isn't good for us. It's
No,
not
it's
good for our
not.
immune systems, correct? Right. But
But
same
we
thing,
don't stop.
but
We
we
just
don't
keep
stop.
going.
But the same thing with death is
Mhm.
that we can never see someone once we heard they were sick. Or maybe we're going to go to
Yeah.
a viewing, maybe. But if we see them embalmed, I mean, I've seen family members embalmed,
Mhm.
and it's not a pretty. It's people that I've known so well for a long period of time. It's not something you want to really hold on to and remember what they look like embalmed. To see them one more time, but they don't really look like the person that you knew your whole life.
Yes, this is so interesting. It's a long ongoing sort of multi-party conversation I've had with people, including funeral directors over the years, about because for a long time, and I think there are a lot of funeral directors who believe this, embalming and viewing the body is not the standard common uh, majority practice that it used to be 50 years ago. We still do a lot of it, but not nearly as much as we used to. America is really the place where that started out. Chemical, cosmetic embalming, to using tinted dye
Hmm.
injected into the body to make them look a little bit less dead is a very American idea.
A little less dead.
A
One
little
more
less dead.
time.
There are actually, I mean, some of the just the funeral industry is so fascinating. If you read trade magazines, especially the old ones, and you look at all the names for the formaldehyde products, there was a brand, my favorite name was called Lifelike Tint. Uh, and it reminds me, a lot of funeral directors have do believe genuinely that the so-called memory picture of the preserved body is a balm to the grief that people are going to carry forward. And for some people, yes. I mean, I've spoken to people who said, yes, it was very nice to see my mother who'd been ravaged by cancer look a little bit more peaceful and less sick. That absolutely happens. But the opposite happens a lot too. And I remember this from when I was 16 years old when my grandmother died. We had seen her. She died of congestive heart failure, which is a pretty gentle way to go. She spent the last week of her life in a hospital unconscious. And the family spent time with her. My cousins, gave her, curled her hair and did her nails and all these sorts of things. We ended up, unfortunately, cutting her hair way too short. So my grandmother became a butch lesbian for her funeral. I love my butch lesbian friends, but you have a very distinctive haircut. Uh, and so we had some fun times, but the last time I saw my grandmother, she looked like my grandmother. She's a very tired old woman. Right. And then a couple days later, we went to the funeral home to see how they had prepared her.
Right.
And there she was. And I'm up next to the casket, and she's got almost no wrinkles on her face. And she's wearing much more makeup than she ever did in life. Her lipstick was really obvious, and it my personal reaction was I was creeped out, and creeped out the way you're creeped out in a horror movie.
Yes.
Um, and I remember kneeling in prayer by the casket, and I could smell the formaldehyde.
Hmm.
Um, and for me, that experience was disturbing. I still remember it. I can still see it. I would prefer not
Hmm.
to, but that's a
Right.
permanent memory now.
Yes.
And I have seen, as you have, Laurel, I have seen dead people au naturel.
Hmm.
And with the exception of traumatic deaths, um, I think a misconception people have is that most dead bodies are really scary. Like there's something out of The Walking Dead,
Hmm.
or that decomposition starts immediately. And so you come back a few minutes later and you've got this horrible, nightmare. That isn't true.
No, it's not.
Most of the time, yeah, people do look dead. They're lying on their back, their blood drains from their face, they become ghastly white. That's normal. Sometimes their eyes are open a little bit, their mouth is open a little bit. So if you're doing home care, funeral care, you're going to need to prop up the chin and close the eyes. But they're not, the dead that are not nearly as frightening as people imagine in their heads.
I agree. So just keeping this to family, my bad memories of seeing my grandfather. I was 10, right? And I was like, I'd encourage you to go see him, right? That's what we do, right?
Sure.
And you're like, oh, I don't really know about that. Not what I expected. Then my grandmother some years later, like, oh, she would have been really upset if she knew that she looked like this, right? So a whole different spectrum of emotion. But then thinking about my father, and we did not have him involved. And we just did a family viewing.
Mm-hmm.
He looked wonderful. I mean,
Yeah.
he definitely looked dead, but
Yeah.
he looked like he was sleeping, and it brought a lot of peace to me. It made
Mm-hmm.
me understand because we kept it. He was in that state. It was a wonderful funeral home that I like
Mm-hmm.
very much here locally, and they did a wonderful job. And
Good.
just he the way he was wrapped, his eyes were closed. It was great, and I felt peace because I knew my dad wasn't in that body anymore. And I think that sometimes something that can happen, is that our minds can, right, be a little bit confused when we see them like halfway brought back to life. So I think that we do well to see someone who's died who has not been,
Yes.
embalmed, and that there's a critical period that even 3 days, I guess it was the third day after he had died. We saw him, in his suit before he was buried. And I thought,
Mm-hmm.
I really enjoyed seeing him a little bit more yesterday than I did today. And
Yeah.
so, even knowing these types of things can be good for us.
Yeah. And the I had a friend who told me a story of her friend. Her friend had died in a motorcycle accident or a car accident. I can't remember which one.
Hmm.
And he, in life, was one of those incredibly good-looking, sexy men. Like just a head turner, right?
Hmm.
He died young. I think he was like 26 years old. And they had an open casket funeral. And my friend told me that she found it incredibly disturbing because they had done such a good job on him that these are her words, he looked hot. He
Mm.
looked just as attractive and fetching as he did in life. And she found that extremely off-putting and very jarring.
Right.
Uh, Trying to negotiate that line between living in life and death.
Hmm.
So this can affect people very differently.
It
And,
can. Hmm.
and most people, uh, part of our pathological fear of death, which leads us to neglect taking part in family ceremonies that might actually be healing and can lead us to spend money on ceremonies that end up leaving us feeling empty. Our pathological fear of death, a lot of it comes from the fact that we just don't see it. Many adults have never, ever in their entire lives seen a corpse. They're 70 or 80 years old. They've never seen a dead
Mm.
body. Or if they've seen a dead body, they've only seen the embalmed version at the funeral home. So people end up, what people think dead people are like comes from horror movies and crime shows.
Hmm.
And, and this goes into the question that people so frequently ask. They say, well, should we let the kids go to the funeral? Yes. In fact, you probably would not have asked that question if we were living in 1860. It would have just been considered normal because the funeral was happening at home. And I say this, this is a critique, but it's a gentle and understanding critique. Adults, please hear me about this. If you have children and you're asking your husband or wife, well, should we let the kids go? what you're doing is actually, it's not about your kid. What you're doing is trying to soothe your own fears.
Mm.
Um, that's what you're doing. And I don't, I'm not trying to be dictatorial, but I think we need to sort of lift the veil off what's really going on
Right.
here. It's you, Mr. Adult, who is worried, nervous, grief stricken, terrified. It's
Hmm.
your neurosis about death that you're trying to manage through saying, well, maybe I shouldn't let my child be there. um, it is the mystery and the hiddenness and the
Mm.
misinformation that ends up creating a neurotic response to death. Allowing the children to see that this is a normal and natural part of life is the best way to inoculate them against morbid rumination.
Hmm. I do believe, and I've got this included in one of the introductory documents for our course for Module 1, is that I think that our decline in mental health has something to do with our denial of death. I mean, I think they
I think so
cannot
too.
be they can't be unattached from one another. But so one thing I think about the end of life doula movement, and I believe that it is, it's the next facet of this whole idea bringing death back home, right? We've
Yep.
outsourced it for way too long. It is detrimental emotionally, financially. uh, I was going to say physically, but I want to say psychologically. Let's say that
Mm-hmm.
it is detrimental. So there's a movement that's been going on for decades. Even the hospice movement itself
Yeah.
is aimed to bring death home. And I just want to tag on to something you said earlier, right? There's like, to have a group of people that now form an industry, though, that are there to help those who need help burying their dead. That's a good thing, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
that it's gone now to this place where it actually can be a harmful thing if done improperly. And we're all very fragile at death. We're more vulnerable when someone that we love has died. There's a door open there for deception. And then that's just how life is,
Yes.
right? Hospice, the wonderful program that it is now an industry, and there is a lot of really you know unfavorable profits that are made, and that turn people into profit mongers, and then those who need hospice care suffer, right? So this is how the world
Mm-hmm.
works, is that a really great thing then becomes there a big industry, and these things always begin to happen. So
Yep.
the death care industry as a whole has a lot of problems, and we're going to talk a little bit more about those here shortly. But this idea of bringing it home, so to speak, is popular. People want to get involved. Baby boomers say, I want to die at home. End of life doulas say, I want to help people die at home. The Funeral Consumers Alliance, wants to help people understand, how we can make this possible. Here are your
Yep.
rights. What state are you in? Here are your rights. All of that is a great movement. It really is. We are unfamiliar with it. Sadly, we're unfamiliar with what the dying process looks like, as
Yep.
you clearly showed us. We're unfamiliar with what a dead person looks like. All of these things. So we have a great challenge in front of us. It's a good challenge, and one to be excited about and engaged in. So all of this is really, really wonderful. One little bit I know about you, and I'm very much looking forward to learning more, is how has it been for you? You've seen the funeral industry become political. And I think I'm saying this right from the little bits of conversation we've had together. And personally, it's upended your life with your disagreements about some of it. When I look at upheaval in my own life, I like to
Yeah.
think that while it was really uncomfortable and may still be uncomfortable, good things come from it. New directions.
I see it the same way. Yeah, it's not major upheavals in our lives, rifts within our families, the end of a job or a segment of a career. These are all they suck when you're going through them. It just sucks.
Yes.
It's depressing. It leaves you feeling insecure, frightened. All the but that's normal. That's
Hmm.
part of life. Yeah. I wouldn't say the funeral industry, well, is it so much that every industry is political in some ways. It's the one thing, the large project I was working on, I ended my time at Funeral Consumers Alliance at the end of 2022. So December 31st, 2022. So it's a year and a half ago now, a little more. And I'd been there for 20 years at that point. And there was always a political aspect because, we had to do lobbying for consumers, because there were trade organizations for funeral directors and we were the voice of the consumers. So the big project I was working on at the end there was getting the Federal Trade Commission, which has something called the funeral rule that governs funeral homes. It says you have to give consumers honest prices over the phone when they ask. You have to hand them a printed price list. You have to allow them to pick item by item. You can't compel families to buy an entire package of goods and services. And you can't lie to them about non-existent legal requirements, such as the claim that embalming is required by law if you're going to view the body. That's not true. So the funeral rule governs these portions of the transaction. Our project, and I think I'm not as closely connected anymore, obviously, but I think this fall we're probably going to hear from the Federal Trade Commission that funeral homes will be required now by the funeral rule to put their prices on their websites to facilitate consumer shopping ahead of time. That was a project that I was working on when I left there. But internally, I think we're talking about activist politics.
Yes, that's the kind of talking about.
So, yeah, I mean, let me do this in a really condensed way. So I spent 20 years at Funeral Consumers Alliance, and I spent most of my adult life. Funeral Consumers Alliance is a nonpartisan organization on paper, but like almost all human service nonprofits these days, in actual practice, in fact, they are a leftist organization.
Yes.
I was a leftist and a card-carrying Democrat and a progressive most of my life. I am not now. Over the past 8 years, I have shifted my views. I'm a conservative now. I no longer agree with most of the things that I used to agitate for. So I have had a very big change of mind and philosophy. But it wasn't clear to me how leftist the organization was until I started to change my mind. And then 3.5 years ago, along with a friend and I started a weekly show, a podcast video show that comments on culture, politics, family relationships, using the lens of narcissism and unstable personalities. And what we do on the show is connect the domestic abuse and child abuse, which was my experience growing up, and the kind of psychology that animates that kind of abuse. The thesis of our show is that what happens in the home has now exploded into society. We are living in a narcissistic society that's full of misrepresentation and reputation smearing and all these nasty things, right? Yes. But part of that show was, and I'm very candid on the show. I mean, we're speaking sort of in a low key way. I'm kind of a firebrand on the show. I swear a lot. I'm very straightforward about my political opinions. I don't sugarcoat anything. And I knew that was probably going to ruffle some feathers, and it did. And it ended up putting me at odds with a lot of people in the organization. And eventually what happened in 2022 was that I'm explicitly anti-woke, okay? And what I mean by woke is far leftism, the idea that we're living in a patriarchal, racist KKK society, that queer people are dying in droves every day. And then, I'm sorry, I'll try to remember I'm on your show, not mine. I don't believe in any of that nonsense because it isn't true. I used to believe in this stuff. And I think now we as a society are very much in danger of becoming an actual repressive communist society if we do not stop this stuff. No, the kinds of things I am responsible for some of this. I helped make this happen as a hardcore leftist, and I feel a duty to speak out about the kinds of things I did before that I wouldn't do now, and where I think we're going. So what ended up happening was when enough people within FCA, the volunteer corps and the affiliated groups around the country, when they discovered my show, they were very offended, and they organized internally a reputation smearing campaign against me and pressured the board of Funeral Consumers Alliance to fire me through extortionary means. Our largest single funder said, "We're pulling all funding from you if you don't fire Slocum." And it was very difficult. I was canceled.
Mm-hmm.
I was canceled.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that's what happened, and
Right.
it isn't surprising, but it is unfortunate because organizations that do good work, like Funeral Consumers Alliance, like many other organizations that really should be above the political fray, are not.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing that and being brave in many ways. I went through a 12-step recovery program and found my only way forward is going to be to actually say, I did this.
Yeah,
Right.
I'm a former drunk too. I get it.
So, right. That's my only way forward my only way towards healing is to expose myself as, someone who makes the wrong choice, or is unable to make a better choice. So I really appreciate your integrity and honesty. And, but, I knew when I was jumping into this end of life doula leadership. I didn't know this when I first joined a training program. It was interesting. I joined in 2019, right before the pandemic and right before George Floyd.
Yeah.
So I've seen just, let's say 2020, start 2020. Okay, so I've seen in the past 3.5 years, if my math is correct, a huge change in the industry. I
How
didn't
so?
know in the end of life doula industry. Yeah.
Okay.
So the woman who trained me, she has. I keep an eye on what she's doing. She, really, and I actually didn't even recertify with her, but she has really focused on the new age spirituality. So I'd actually find her to be my biggest uh, competitor, more so
Okay.
than some of the other doula training programs, because we're both looking at the work that we do from the aspect of healing. And then the other end of like doula training programs, well, I can't speak for all of them because I know there's a lot of small ones in there that have, they're like $500 and they're very, study by yourself. But the bigger groups that funnel their doulas into NEDA, National End of Life Doula Alliance. I've seen
Okay.
this kind of wedded, enmeshed relationship going on that does have to do with identity politics. And
Okay.
I even know a woman who is trained by them. I met her through a church thing, and I've said to her, well, she's got a website and she promotes where she was trained, and I know that place is very thick on identity politics. NEDA
Hmm.
is the same. I mean, it's all over their website. It's all diversity,
Yep.
equity, inclusion. So I said to her, well, thinking, well, maybe she would like to promote my ministry on her site. Well, she said no. And she said she didn't use, but she used the word, I can't remember the word she used, but she gave me a reason. And I thought, really? And so then the more I think about it is I really think that the doula movement itself is now, like it says, it's centered on the welfare of everybody. And in some ways, I think it is. Everyone who decides to be a doula, they do want the best for the people that they're serving. But it's a little bit misguided, in my opinion, is that they're so focused on the identity of that person that actual all the other things that need to go on with end of life care maybe are taking a second rank to making sure that they're promoting whatever that identity is. And so I think too, to make this end of life doula movement go and to make the role to be one of integrity, I even see it the way that they band together on social media. You go look at the Funeral Consumers Alliance. Well, all the doulas are liked by them and they follow them. And then you look in, oh, okay, well then there's Nita. It's all in there together. And I found that I'm really outside of that. And I think that there's this idea that if they all band together, it's going to set off something. And so they've wedded together
Okay.
all of their initiatives together. And so I'm even seeing people that I know that I'm very surprised they've go that direction. So I think it's out of fear on one level. And another level is that the industry itself, or the doula, I'm gonna call it the doula industry, this group of
Okay. Sure.
programs, springing up, the alliance, which is, supposed to funnel everyone in together into one big group, is like they don't know how to spread and grow without hitching itself to this. So that's really
Yeah.
what I've seen happen. Because when I got started, I'm like, wow, this is going to be really great. I'm just going to learn the skill. I'm going to market myself. I am going to be, an independent contractor, go in and work with families. I thought it was that
Yeah.
simple. But what I've seen over 3.5 years is that there's actually an undercurrent to it. And I think it's less about actually the people that you serve as it is about promoting a propaganda.
Yeah, I agree with you. And it's dispiriting.
Spiriting.
But it isn't new. I hear you when you say you saw this big change over the past 3.5 to 4 years. Basically, any segment of American life we can look at and say, "Ooh, there was a big change in these
Mhm.
past." Yeah, so I know that you're right about
Right.
that. But I will go back further and say the seeds were always there. I remember when I first. I want to tell people. I'll just illustrate this. Really one of the foremothers of the home funeral movement was my friend and mentor, Lisa Carlson, who died last year. Her husband, Steve, just died a couple of months ago. Um, she was the executive director of Funeral Consumers Alliance in the 90s. She's the one who hired me and she groomed me to replace her.
Hmm.
I know that that word has taken on another connotation these days, but I mean just in the ordinary apprenticeship sense.
Hmm.
And uh, a fireball of a woman, um, and sometimes very difficult to get along with, very mercurial.
Hmm.
She had but she was honest as the day is long, and she was genuine and caring. She put her foot in her mouth a lot, but she was also an incredibly generous, um, genuine person. And she wrote about doing a home funeral first when her husband committed suicide in 1981, I believe, 80 or 81. And she was forced into doing a home funeral for lack of money. But she quickly discovered the emotional and spiritual benefit.
Mm.
So she wrote a book about it. Then she became involved with Funeral Consumers Alliance and decided to advocate for all people who needed funeral services, not just the home funeral people. And I remember when we first met in the late 90s, around 2000, and I over the phone, and then I came up here to Vermont to take the job in 2002. And she warned me about, because Lisa was very much into the home funeral thing, but she really
Mhm.
took it seriously. She said, "It is not my job, it's not your job to pass judgment on what people do in funeral rituals. Our job is to empower them to do it for themselves or
Mhm.
to make the right commercial choices that fit their circumstances." She
Mhm.
really meant
Very
that.
fair, right?
And but she warned me about some of the home funeral people, and she said a lot of them are in it because they need to be needed.
Mhm.
It's more about their own ego than it is about serving the families. And she had already had some disagreements with some of the home funeral people 20 years ago, because it already then it was all Northern California new age hippie
Mhm.
people. This is not a criticism of that.
Mhm.
I'm just, just saying, Lisa would say to people, you are going to severely restrict your audience. The people who are willing to hear your message and learn from you is going to be very small if you continue to brand yourself. She didn't use these words, but basically with leftist lifestyle identity politics.
Mhm.
I said the same things throughout my career at Funeral Consumers Alliance. I'm not surprised anymore. But you know, it didn't do a damn bit of good. That's what
Yeah.
happened.
Yeah, and I don't know if my eyes have just been opened, as a lot of people's, majority of our eyes have been open and we're
Yeah.
surprised. And, even I think a lot, I being in New York, a very liberal state, I was in New York. I've watched, myself and friends very, very much pivot through COVID-19 and the things that have
Yeah.
ensued since that point. And so, we can say, I think, it's our eyes have been open. So as I entered something naively,
Hmm.
what could be better than an end of life doula role? Typically work in a church. I work around people who are facing death or someone in their family's facing death. Like that's what I do. So why would an end of life doula education not just really really benefit that? And so I think the role is so wonderful. Like I believe in it. I even took me a while to get my first client. That was because COVID hit, and then we all had to be separated. I did make newsletters and tried to market on social media, but I wasn't able to get any traction. So
Yeah.
basically, after the end of that year, I thought, well, maybe this just isn't going to become anything. And so I was in a master's degree program, just kind of put my heart into that, and then I got a client, and it was it went just like it should. What I was
Hmm.
trained that an end of life like doula can how an end of life doula can help, and I thought I'm back on board. Like this is excellent, right? And then I had another client. Went really well. I made a big impact. Yeah, he went to my church, and we that made a big impact in the church community on. I don't think they really cared I was a doula, but the fact that I brought together the dying person in the community, right? So it was a success in that way. So I was, really decided, gosh, this has got to be something. We don't want to let this role go away. And but I also fear at the same time that there's two parts I fear. And one is that the good stuff about a doula, a good stuff about a home funeral, the good stuff about, all these things we want to bring back home may be confiscated by a leftist movement. Like people, like you and I may say, well, I'm going to stay as far away from that as possible because it's taken on this idea where we want to make sure people understand, no, 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 this is really good. Even though they're doing that, let them do it, right? We
Sure.
can still use all of these benefits and get completely involved without falling into that trap, whether it
Yeah.
be new age, whether it be
Yes.
activism.
That's the frustration. This is because this is not a partisan issue. It's not. This is a human issue. We all are born. We all die.
Yeah,
We all have to be buried or cremated or something,
right.
right? This grief is, we're humans. It's the degree of polarization it, and politicization of every facet of our lives is, it's more than disheartening. It's almost, it's soul crushing. I don't want to sound hyperbolic, but whew,
Yeah.
um, this, what we're talking about here has nothing to do with whether you vote Democrat, Republican, Libertarian, write-in candidate. It has nothing to do with what you think about tax policy or abortion policy or any of these other things. It's nothing to do with that. But there is no area of life, it seems, in America and in the West generally, that is not subject to this shoehorning into a lifestyle statement, a political identity lifestyle statement. Um, I don't know if, Laurel, I don't know. I think the best that somebody like you can look forward to at this point is people people need to be able to sort themselves into the tracks that make sense to them. So the people who want a Christian focused way of learning about how to care for the dead are going to sort themselves into what you do. The people
Mhm.
who have new age beliefs are going to sort themselves into, the larger end of life movements within that community. But I haven't been able to figure out a way that this idea can be marketed or educated about in a completely non-political, non-partisan way that will be appealing to everybody. And maybe that doesn't exist.
Mhm. I've been thinking a lot about that actually since you and I got connected last week, or about a week and a half or so ago. That, yeah, is the mainstream way that we're seeing, through social media, through, trying to get caught up on the algorithms and getting all the likes. Is that really the way to get this message out? I don't think so. I think all of that is trendy, and I fear at some points the fervor with which the end of life doula movement has gained speed
Mm-hmm.
over leftist ideals makes me wonder, what's the longevity? Because I just think and that ends up bringing more harm, right? Remember the end of life
Yeah.
doula movement. So it brings more harm. Uh,
Here's what I think is going to
yeah.
happen.
Hmm.
Um, so 15 between 15 and 20 years ago, I got involved with what was then known as the New Atheist Movement. This was a very political branch of atheist thought that was centered around well-known people like biologist Richard Dawkins, philosopher Sam Harris, journalist and commentator Christopher Hitchens, and it was a whole new identity. And this happened. I mean, I look back on it now and I see so many excesses that I indulged in and that other people indulged in there. But there was a reasonable justification for why that agitation first started, because back then there was a problem in the United States of certain extreme fundamentalist Christian sects were having some success, or appeared to be having some success, in trying to get young earth creationism taught in science class in public schools, very clearly very religious, partisan religious way of doing this. And so the New Atheist movement was in some senses a justifiable reaction movement to that, but it took on a life of its own and became a monster of its own. And it was taken over by, I mean, I say taken over, it probably always started there, but it became more explicitly woke leftist. Before we had the word woke, we still had the same things.
Mhm.
Um, and I was one of the big, I mean, not, I wasn't, obviously a leader or anything. I was one of the rabble, but I was one of the loudmouths, and I went to the conferences, and um, I pulled away from that when I finally realized how toxic all of it was, as my belief system started changing. And it burned out. I mean, there are still people who are involved with them. They still hang around the same blogs and stuff, but it is no cultural force
Right.
to be reckoned with. I suspect something like that may happen with some of the more identitarian
Hmm.
ends of the end of life thing, because really these communities psychologically can be characterized as an expression of communal narcissism.
Hmm.
This is self-regarding, self-aggrandizing thinking. A lot of people don't necessarily mean it to be. They really do believe their own publicity. They think that they're
Right.
helping other people, but what they're really doing is glorifying themselves.
Yeah, it's true. The virtue signaling,
Mm-hmm.
is very, very strong. You know, when I was in getting my master's degree, I started out at not in seminary for it, but I was getting like a theological degree through a really cool university over in England remotely. And then because COVID hit, I couldn't do one time the annual meeting with my professor and other students. So I took my credits I had earned and went into a seminary to finish it. And it was very, very interesting because I did know before I went there that it was progressive on LGBTQ issues, but it changed, and it changed dynamically between the, well, I guess when I entered in, I was like, whoa, I don't know how I'm going to be able to handle this. And I was very upset about it, but it really was my only option of schools because of the campus. And I could have a 3-bedroom apartment with my children, which is almost impossible for a single mom in New York
Yes.
City, right? And they
Yes.
accepted all my credits. And it was just like, okay, it was in my neighborhood. I couldn't pass it up, but but
Yeah.
I knew it was more progressive than I was used to. I grew up in the fundamentalist Christianity, and so here I am on the opposite spectrum of being in completely full progressive Protestantism. And so I think of my time there, and I actually really did learn a lot, even though I didn't enjoy my time. But I had a black woman under my care, doula care, and I had a gay man with
Hmm.
HIV under my doula care during my time there. And it was so funny to me because I also got called out as a racist homophobe while I was there because because it's something I put in the discussion board about. I wasn't ashamed that I grew up in the Southeast because God has, done wonderful things in my life. Like, why am I going to be ashamed of where, my family lives when I was born and that I lived there? Like, like people have to
Yeah.
look deeper into my story, right? Than to just categorize me as a person who grew up in the Southeast. And like that, like to me, that wasn't fair. So I pushed back on this discussion board and said, my mother worked in prisons as a volunteer with Prison Fellowship. My father is a physician and spent, many years working on an Indian reservation. Like, don't just come to me because I said I grew up in Alabama and make, and create my identity for me, right? And so
Yeah.
I got a lot of blowback on that. And so anyway, I got this, the people perceive me as a racist and a homophobe, and I don't even know where the homophobe part came in, and so anyway, it's just because they're slinging like defamations at anybody that they can, right? And so
Yeah.
I pretty much kept it quiet that I had, these 2 clients. Like nobody really wanted to get to know me, so I wasn't going to share any of this. But the
Hmm.
reason I'm making, this into a point here is that here I was by love and God's call on my life in service to these 2 demographics that had me under such scrutiny that I was a bigot, where everybody else was spending their time not actually serving but coming to find what my shortcomings were. And so it just to me really elevated what the point and the narcissistic future of that movement is, because they're not really looking at real life. They're looking at what they want to look at and going through and just lumping criticism on people. So say I decided not to do those 2 jobs for whatever reason. Those people may have gone without the level of care that I was able to give them. So all of this just lumping things into certain categories is just not going to actually get us the results that we want with
Hmm.
making sure that people have the care that they need. And I, really pay attention to, why is this doula movement necessary? It's because we have so many perils around end of life care. And yes, poor communities may hit perils that wealthier communities, may not have. But that I don't think that our answer to fixing it is going to be through the activism that everybody is so caught up in.
Yeah.
Because then we can't even communicate. And then they're saying that, well, just because maybe he's over there in that community, she doesn't care about the other community. And so the whole thing is just one big lie.
Yeah.
It really is.
I know. It's
Well,
sad.
I want to say thank you. We'll come to a closure here on this part. Thank you for being open and sharing your
Thank you
experience.
thank you for doing the work you do, and thank you for being one of the people in end of life, death, doula, home funeral guide care who will talk about the reality of this issue. There aren't enough, so I'm glad that you will.
Yes, no, I don't think we live in a time that we can be shy about what we believe to be the truth. And I want to say, so what do we do next, right? So you are coming back on another video with me that we're going to
Yes.
open to, have students, and I actually
Yeah.
sent
I'm
out
really looking forward to it.
a wider announcement. So hopefully there'll be some people who aren't in the training program that just want to
Yeah.
learn. And we're going to say, let's talk about it. What is a
Yeah.
clean funeral? What can you do? What are your rights? So I'm very excited about this. This was a little
Yep.
introduction to you and your work and your passion and where we're headed. So I'm very grateful, Josh. I'm going to end the recording.